the book of Ruth. Does anybody remember what we talked about last week?
How everything's like interconnected, and it's like the Matrix, and how everything's doing from, and it like blows your mind how everything is like proper stuff.
Yeah, and it's proof that it's all one author.
The difference between like the Greek meaning of prophecy and a Hebrew.
Yep. Which was?
The Greek one was like, they say something and it's fulfilled in the future, and the Hebrew meaning was like, something happens in the past and then it like happens again or something in the future.
Yeah, sort of like a pattern. It's like a foreshadowing. It's like an acting out of something that is going to happen in the future. And so we looked at an example of that, which was Abraham and Isaac. It's a really, really cool example of that, where like God is literally telling them to do these things, which seem really strange. But what he's actually doing is getting them to act out a prophecy, the ultimate prophecy, the prophecy about Jesus, right? So that's exactly what we talked about, was the idea that the Bible is not just some random books that have these ideas that are vaguely similar to each other, maybe are kind of relevant to God, that it's this one thing. Everything's integrated with each other, every single detail matters, and everything's about Jesus. And when you start to see that, when you see that everything in the Old Testament is not just random things, it's not just telling us stuff that happened, that it's all part of like explaining to us what God is ultimately doing for us and with us, then you start to realize that this is not a book that's just got a whole bunch of authors that we've put together, that God was in control of the whole thing, that he was the ultimate author, and then he put everything there for a reason. And so then what's the relevance to Ruth? Why is that an introduction to the book of Ruth?
Jesus' great-great-great-great-grandmother.
Yep. So very briefly at the end last week, I said that there's lots of great things about the book of Ruth. One, it's a nice story. It's beautiful, it's simple, it's only 4 chapters. I encourage all of you to read it this week.
I don't know.
You should read it. It's only 4 chapters. It'll probably only take you 15 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that. 2 10-minute reading sessions and you've read the book of Ruth. And then you'll know what the story is, and so when we talk about stuff, it'll make more sense. So it's a nice story to read. It's also a story that it was a true story. Wait.
The Bible is
The Bible, well, yes, okay. But this is a real story that happened, and it's a story that is historically significant because, as you said, Ruth is of Jesus. So, great-grandmother of David, King David, and if you're a grandmother of King David, that means you're a great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus. And so it's a story that is significant historically, and it's obviously significant to us because it relates to Jesus. It's also a story that is practically useful because it deals with all sorts of interesting or useful themes that are useful in our lives, like loyalty, faithfulness. One of the things we'll talk about a bit today is hope in the face of tragedy, because that's really what's all through the book of Ruth. And then redemption is the main theme of the book of Ruth, our Redeemer, and that's the gospel, right? It's redemption. That's what it's all about. And so it's a book that's also practically significant and useful to us. All great reasons to study the book of Ruth, but not the main reason why we're reading the book of Ruth. The main reason why we're studying it is because the entire book of Ruth is prophetic. It is a dramatic prophecy, a dramatized prophecy. It's acting out in the lives of the people we're going to read about. It's acting out the gospel, which we'll see more clearly at the end, when we get to the end. But I want you to have that in mind as we're reading through it. And you can be that's a challenge for you guys, is to try to figure out if you can see why the story of Ruth is prophetic of the gospel. Which is like I said, these are one of the ways that you see that God authored the Bible. is when you see the way that these stories that are there that seem to be somewhat insignificant in the Bible are actually all part of the big picture that God's trying to communicate to us. And of all the Old Testament books, the book of Ruth is probably the book that is most relevant to us as the church. Why is that? Well, another little Jewish lesson. In Jewish culture, they have particular portions of the Bible that they read at particular times of the year. And the book of Ruth is always read at the Feast of Weeks. So there are 7 feasts prescribed by God in the Old Testament for the Jews to observe. There are 4 in Northern Hemisphere spring, our autumn, and 3 in the Northern Hemisphere autumn, our spring. All right? We're actually hitting this season. Not just yet. End of March, pretty much, is spring season in the north. You have the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, and the Feast of Weeks. Does anybody know when Jesus was crucified?
Easter.
We call it Easter.
Is it one of the spring ones?
Is
Is
it
it
Unleavened
possible?
bread?
Isn't it in the spring?
It isn't spring. It's Easter, right? So we know it's there.
Is it the unleavened?
So you know the Last Supper,
Oh,
right? That Jesus celebrated with the disciples the night before he was crucified?
Yeah.
That wasn't just some random meal that they were having. That was Passover. It was the Passover meal. And at the end of March, I think for first Friday of April, which is Good Friday, I think, we're going to be doing that. We're going to be experiencing Passover meal within Fusion Youth. And it's amazing. It's like mind-blowing. It's all about Jesus. It's very, very cool. Jesus was crucified on Passover. What does the Feast of Passover commemorate?
When the angel death passed over.
Right. So it's Israel leaving Egypt, right? And specifically, it's remembering the time when the angel of death passed over the Israelites. Didn't pass over the Israelites. It passed over everybody who painted the blood of the Passover lamb on their houses, right? Which is like, that's exactly what, that is prophetic of what we do in Jesus, right? He is our Passover lamb. He's described as that in the New Testament. And we have to apply his blood to our lives. And if we do, angel of death passes over us. We pass from death to life, right? So, the Feast of Passover is all about Jesus' sacrifice for us. Jesus was sacrificed on Passover, which is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, the next feast is called the Feast of First Fruits. The Feast of First Fruits is celebrated on the first Sunday after Passover. What happened on the Sunday after Jesus was crucified? He was resurrected. First day of the week, right? So Jesus was he was crucified on Passover. He was resurrected on the Feast of First Fruits. The Feast of First Fruits, the idea with the Feast of First Fruits is with both of these, you're celebrating the harvest, right? And the idea is there's a big harvest coming, but initially there's some first stalks of wheat that ripen. And you take those and you give them to God. And they are the first fruits of the harvest that is coming, right? Does that kind of make sense? Jesus' resurrection, so this is why Paul describes Jesus as the first fruits of the dead. He was the first to be resurrected, but the fact that he was resurrected tells you that there's a big resurrection harvest coming. Does that kind of make sense? Because just like those first fruits of wheat, for example, the fact that they ripen tells you the rest are going to ripen in the next, about seven weeks later. And so the analogy is the same thing, but in terms of our resurrection, is that Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. He rose first, But his rising is a promise that the rest of the resurrection is going to come, that everybody else is going to be resurrected later. Right? Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Okay. 7 weeks later, 50 days, is the Feast of Weeks. That's when they celebrate the full harvest. Right? In Greek, the Feast of Weeks is called Pentecost. It means 50. Right? 50 days. That's the number of days from the Feast of First Fruits to the Feast of Weeks. What happened on Pentecost, 50 days after Jesus was resurrected? Holy Spirit descended on the people, on the disciples, and the 3,000 people were saved. Right? The church was born. And so you have Jesus resurrected on the Feast of First Fruits. 50 days later, the church is born. 3,000 people spiritually are resurrected. But millions and millions and millions of people ultimately are going to be resurrected. The full harvest that Jesus was the first fruits of. Does that make sense? So anyway, the point is, these feasts of Israel are prophetic. But not just in some general sense. Like, God fulfilled each of these feasts on the exact day of the feast. Does that make sense? Which is amazing to me. And it's like, it shows you how precise he is in his plan and in his prophecy. Anyway, so like I said, the feast, it's during the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, the birth of the church, the birthday of the church, that the book of Ruth is read. Not by Christians, by Jews. Which I think is also a hint that there's more going on in this book. And that it has probably got some kind of significance to us, to the church. Which is why we're looking at it. Cool? Okay. That was the end of the introduction, which I didn't get to last week.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so have you guys all got Bibles? Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. Who wants to read?
Okay, what am I doing? Chapter 1, verse 1?
Just the first verse.
Oh, okay. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem.
Okay, that's all.
Oh.
For now. Okay.
There's a famine.
So,
Bye.
some context. The story is set during the time of the first
Time of the root.
time of the judges. So this came after God had saved Israel out of Egypt, after they'd been led around the wilderness with Moses and been fed by God, after they'd conquered the land of Canaan through Joshua, but before God had given them a king. And so it was during this time that it says again and again and again in the book of Judges that Israel had no king, and everyone did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. Does that sound like a good time or a bad time? Generally speaking, the book of Judges, the time of the Judges, was not a good time in Israel's history. Basically, there was just this repeating cycle of God would bless them, they'd then start worshipping idols, fall away from God. God would then allow some nearby nation to oppress them. They'd eventually cry out to God for help. God would give them a deliverer. In the Bible, they're called judges, but they're basically people who led Israel for some short period of time. Through that leader, so you've got people like Samson, Gideon, Deborah. They would lead Israel for a period of time. They'd free Israel, or God would free Israel through this person from whatever nation is oppressing them. They'd be blessed again, and then once they're blessed, they'd forget God, start worshipping idols, and the whole cycle would start again. Does that sort of sound like a familiar kind of cycle in life?
Yeah.
It reminds me of this verse in Proverbs, which I think is very wise. It says, 2 things I ask of you, Lord, do not refuse me before I die. Keep falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of my God. That, for me, has been like for a long time in prayer. Basically, that God would just give you what you need. Because if he gives you more than you need, it's hard to trust God when you don't need him. You know? But obviously, if he gives you less than you need, too much less than you need, then there's danger that you dishonor him in other ways. But just, please give me what I need. Anyway, that was basically the process for Israel for about 400 years, was the cycle of having more than they needed, then falling away from God, oppression, turning back to God, being delivered, and then the whole thing starts again. So that's the first bit of context. So during the time of the judges. And then where is this happening? What does it say? Before that. Actually, yours might be a slightly different order. It's in Judah, right? In the land of Judah. So we're in the land of Judah, which means we're dealing with the descendants of Israel, Jacob, through his son Judah, which is down in the south of Israel. And we're told that there's a famine in the land. Now, in the Bible, famine is usually associated with judgment from God. So God had promised Israel that as long as they were faithful to him, they would have everything they need in the land of Israel. But if they abandoned him and particularly worshipped other gods, they would experience famine. And they're experiencing famine, which suggests that things are not going so well in Israel at this time. Now, one of the judges, one of the leaders of Israel that God raised up was Gideon. And during Gideon's, or in the story of Gideon, God has allowed the Midianites to oppress Israel for 7 years. And it specifically says that they stole and destroyed all of the crops in Israel, leaving nothing for anybody in Israel to eat. And that lasted for 7 years. So it's possible that the famine that we're reading about here in Ruth is the famine that was caused by the Midianites' oppression, but we don't really know. It doesn't tell us. Okay, you can carry on.
When I read to,
just finish that verse.
of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons.
Okay, so now we have a bit more information here. We're reading about somebody who's a descendant of Judah who lived where? In Bethlehem. Relevance?
His name is Moab.
Why was Jesus born in Bethlehem?
Backwards.
Because the baby is going to be some 5 minutes.
Why did he have to go to Bethlehem though?
They all had to count up all the people and they were go back to your
Yeah, I know. So they had to go back to their hometown. Why did Joseph have to go to Bethlehem?
Because that's where Mary's Bethlehem's cool.
Because that was his hometown. Why was that his hometown? Because he was a descendant of
Judah.
Moab.
Ultimately King David, right? He was a descendant both Joseph and Mary were descendants of David. David was from Bethlehem. How do we know that David was from Bethlehem?
Does it say somewhere?
It does, in the book of Ruth.
Oh, what do you know?
Yeah. So Ruth is one of the reasons why we know that David was from Bethlehem. And of course, that has relevance to some of the prophecies in the Bible that talks about the Messiah coming out of Bethlehem as a descendant of David. So, the name Bethlehem means house of bread.
I love bread.
So nice.
And so, traditionally, Bethlehem was a really rich, a region that was rich in agriculture, lots of food. But obviously, there's not much bread going on at the moment because they're in a famine. And so, this man that we've read about decides to leave Bethlehem, the house of bread, and move to Moab, which is a region on the other side of the Dead Sea. So, geography, Africa, Egypt, Sinai Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, up into Europe, Turkey. Here's Israel. Judah's down here. There's Bethlehem. Moab was across the Dead Sea. At that stage, the Dead Sea was a bit bigger than it is now, but that's the region of Moab that they moved to. So who was Moab?
So it was a person.
It was a person.
Oh, so cool. I told you all.
This is where the descendants of the person Moab lived. Who was Moab?
Wow, Moab lived in Moab?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah,
Wow.
whole country named after him.
I've never heard the name Moab.
No?
Wait.
Backwards is Moab.
It's not a very nice story, but Moab is one of Lot's sons.
Oh.
If you remember, Lot was Abraham's nephew. They were traveling around together, but then they split up.
And the salt woman.
And Lot moved to Sodom, which was an unbelievably evil city. You can read that part of Genesis if you want to be shocked. And anyway, God destroys Sodom, but saves Lot and his family out of Sodom. His wife turned around and was killed, and he and his daughters went and hid in the mountains. And she was then dead.
Oh wait, so she was
So she cried in her own
She did. Well, that's what it says. Anyway, so Lot is hiding in the mountains with his daughters. His daughters are worried because there's no men around. So they get their dad horribly drunk.
Oh, I read that.
And
Wait,
the
no,
result...
everything.
Wait, so that's something.
And the result is Moab and Ammon.
Amen. Get it? Amen.
From both. Wait, but from both.
So not a nice story. So anyway, this is Moab. Moab were cursed by God, not because of that, but because they refused to allow Israel to pass through their land when they were fleeing from Egypt, and they hired Balaam to curse Israel. But anyway, so Moab were cursed by God, and this man from Bethlehem had basically chosen to flee God's land to return to the wilderness, the cursed wilderness that Israel had been saved from. So, probably not a good plan, but that's where we are. Verse 2. Who wants to read verse 2?
I will.
You can go around, take turns.
Can I
Joey?
go?
Whoever. Do you want to read? You don't have to, if you want to. Okay, verse 2.
The name of the man was Elimelech, or Melech, I don't know. The name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there.
So, names in the Bible are often significant. This guy, Elimelech, that's two words. Eli means my God, Melech means king.
Oh.
So my God is king.
Elimelech.
Elimelech.
How do you say?
Elimelech.
Elimelech.
So that's a particularly interesting name given the time in Israel's history, right? Because they have no king. They have no king. Which I guess is the point, right? The whole point was God was supposed to be their king. And at least in this guy's name,
It's a pun.
he understood, or at least his parents understood, that God was their king. Although, at this point, it at least doesn't appear as though he is acting like God is his king. But the story demonstrates that God is still very much in control of what's going on in Israel and in the lives of his people. Yeah. Naomi means pleasant.
Pleasant?
Yeah.
Like a pheasant.
It's a nice name.
Yeah.
Pleasant.
Pleasant. That's not what I expected.
Now, in the Bible, the land of Israel is very often described as the pleasant land.
Pleasant.
Wow.
And I don't think that's an accident, and I think as we're going to find out, that is a little detail in the story that's there by design and has significance. Mahlon means unhealthy
Oh.
or sickly. And his brother Kilion means to waste away or to wither.
Oh, that's so sad. Wow, they got creative.
So obviously not great names for your kids.
Good names and then
I'm guessing they weren't healthy children. And anyway, do you want to read verse 3?
And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, yea, and she was left to her 2 sons.
Oh, and verse 4.
Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Oprah, and the name of the other Ruth. Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, and which was
Okay. So, they get there and Naomi's husband, Elimelech, dies.
His name should have been Mark.
So, Elimelech went to Moab to make his life easier. Right? The grass looked greener on the other side of the Jordan. But was it?
No.
For him?
No, he died.
No, it wasn't. And I think that should be a word of caution for all of us as well. That the grass might sometimes look greener to you on the outside of the promised land, outside of the place where God has you, but it is always a mirage. You will never find more peace or joy in your life than being where God wants you, in God, regardless of how it might look. The other thing is that people often, when they're faced with tragedy or suffering in their lives, abandon God, which is kind of like what Elimelech has done here, right? He faces famine in Israel, and so he flees Israel to Moab. But that doesn't make the suffering or the tragedy any easier. And in fact, it usually makes it harder because now you're suffering on your own. You don't even have God with you. Plus, you usually add bitterness and anger to everything, which just makes everything that much worse. In the book of Revelation, hell is described as a bottomless pit. And there's a... Sorry? Well, there was this nice analogy that somebody gave that I heard that I thought was clever, that there's a sense in which that is true even in life, that no matter how bad a situation is, you can always find a way to make it worse, right? It's not that hard, however bad something is. And you see this all the time. Like if you have a family who's lost a loved one and they're all devastated and in pain, and then they're all fighting about the funeral arrangements, and is there not already enough pain in this situation? Do you really need to make it even worse? Anyway, that tends to be exactly what happens when people blame God for their suffering. They become angry and bitter, and in the process make everything that much worse. So they're angry with God for allowing suffering, but then in their very actions, they're making that suffering worse. So the best thing you can do when you're faced with tragedy and suffering is to cling to God even more tightly, to cry out to Him and ask Him to strengthen you, and to come to Him just like Jesus told us to. In Matthew, He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, I will give you rest." You come before Jesus and depend on Him to give you the strength to endure whatever it is that you're facing, so that you might actually become stronger, more faithful, more dependable through it, and that you might become the kind of person who can actually lighten other people's burdens. That God can shine through you and through your tragedy to lighten the world that's around you, rather than just to make it even darker. Anyway, so Naomi's left all alone in Moab with her 2 sons, Mahlon and Kilion. And while they're there, they get married. Mahlon marries somebody called Ruth, and Kilion marries somebody called Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah.
We should have a
Ruth. The name Ruth means friend or companion, and the name Orpah means like gazelle, but it comes from a word that means like the back of the neck. And the idea is that when something's fleeing from you, like a gazelle, all you see is the back of their neck. And I think that as we'll find, as we continue reading the story, there's significance between their names as well. Alright, so we'll leave it there and we'll pick up again next week with verse 4.